Good morning. I'll try that again. I'm not sure if it went through. Good morning, just in case. It's always worth it twice anyway. To my colleagues at the Stable Value Investment Association, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, John Cydoledes. John is a Washington, D.C. government affairs and geopolitical risk specialist with 35 years of experience informing various audiences of U.S. and global risk trends, international threat assessments, and geopolitical intelligence strategies. He launched and directed two respected international relations institutes in Washington, D.C., and was contracted with the Department of State since 2006. One of his key projects over the past 15 years involves the State Department's Diplomatic Academy at the Foreign Services Institute, where he continues to deliver world-class diplomatic training to U.S. foreign affairs professionals so they can advance American foreign policy and excel in the global arena. He has testified before Congress and is a regular media commentator on national security and American politics over broadcast, print, and digital media. John holds a master's degree in international affairs, specializing in international security policy from the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. In addition to John's amazing pedigree, this is a topic that I think we will all find fascinating, even if a little unsettling. So let's get started. John, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for that kind introduction. And a special thank you to Gina Mitchell and to the Stable Value Investment Association for inviting me to address all of you here this morning. What I'd like to do, ladies and gentlemen, and just pardon me here as I walk through this process of getting the slide deck up, is I'd like to unpack a lot of the very stark information that we're dealing with here in Washington, D.C. about what is happening around the world. And what I've tried to do here is to put this together for you in what I trust will be a visually compelling presentation using, unclassified public domain sources, clearly, in what I'd like to think of as a simplified, generalized national security briefing for all of you. One caveat before I begin, ladies and gentlemen, and that is, as Andrew noted in the kind introduction, the State Department is a client of my firm, but everything that I state here today and all that I represent involves my presentation in a purely private and individual capacity, and nothing that I say here today represents the U.S. government or the Department of State. So having laid all of this out, ladies and gentlemen, let me just give you a little bit of a heads up. This is going to be a very stark presentation. I don't dabble in optimism or pessimism. I deal in realism. And you're a very well-informed audience. You're on top of the news, and I hope that you'll respect that as I respect your desire to learn more about what is happening in the world and where trends and developments are taking us. But we start with what I consider to be a pretty straightforward situation, and that is that the world today is more complex and more dangerous than at any time in at least the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And what I'd like to do, ladies and gentlemen, is first of all offer a little bit of a background here from a geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective, because geographically, we human beings are very terrestrial creatures, of course. We're land-based, and we tend to think of the world from a land-based perspective. But this map here helps offer a very interesting reminder that 70% of the Earth's surface is water. It's oceans, it's seaways, it's waterways. And it's on this 70% of the Earth's surface that about 90% of global trade and commerce occurs every year. And similarly, about 80 to 85% of the world's oil and natural gas moves around the Earth on the world's oceans, waterways, and seas. And so this is the basis for the liberal, rules-based international order that over the last 20 to 30 years, again, since the end of the Cold War, has given us the greatest prosperity that mankind has ever known. And in many ways, there has never been a better time to be alive in the history of mankind than today, October 12th, 2021. And this snapshot here of the global economy offers a useful insight into the fact that the United States and China, whether it's nominal GDP or PPP, are the top two economies of the world. And it gives you a good comparative sense of how the US and China configure against every other major country in the world. But we're talking about, again, a time of unprecedented prosperity. It has been unprecedented in so many ways, not only economically, but technologically, certainly in terms of material benefits for everyday people, and also the astonishing rise from destitute poverty of hundreds of millions of people around the world. It continues today in places such as South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. But in many ways, what's been astonishing over the last 20 years is how it took place in China. And much of that really is owed to the US and the global West, our partners in Asia and in Europe, the developed economies of the world that admitted China into the World Trade Organization in 2002. In honestly, many ways that China was not prepared. It had not fully qualified, but there was this larger governing political philosophy that China, as a relatively underdeveloped economy, but one given its massive size, as it became wealthier, would become hopefully more liberalized, have a more consensual government, and would move away from the kind of communist rule that we saw in the Soviet Union before its 1991 collapse, as we continue to see in North Korea and Cuba, and that China would become a quote unquote responsible stakeholder in the liberal rules-based international order. Now, from a Chinese perspective, this was just one more step in China rising to what is its historic natural role atop the global economy. And this chart does wonders in explaining to us how China was the world's leading economy for almost 1,800 years, sort of a vast span of human history until about the early to mid 1800s, where for a number of reasons centered largely around China's inability to import the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century and to take advantage of the technological revolution beginning in the mid 20th century, was a laggard behind the United States and other countries that rose beyond it. And so China today aspires to restore its, what it considers to be rightful place atop the world economy. And that would be a very good thing for the world if it was a matter of shared prosperity in this liberal rules-based international order that I've described. But there is a very fundamental problem in the manner in which China has risen over the last 20 years. And that is that it is not a quote unquote normal country in the developed world, but it is ruled by a gentleman that we know day to day as President Xi Jinping. But President Xi was not elected either democratically, as is the case in many European countries, or via a constitutional Republican system as we have here in the United States. His base of power is the fact that he achieved the status of General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And ladies and gentlemen, I will posit to you one critical takeaway of this presentation, I hope will be that every decision that Xi Jinping makes is not under the guise of the presidency of the People's Republic of China, but as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, which for the most part continues to be guided by a rigid Leninist ideology that has allowed for astonishing, phenomenal, capitalist-type growth in the Chinese economy, but all under the rubric of absolute control over all aspects of China's society, government, economy, military, education system. Everything must be absolutely controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And so we have a very different type of sort of future imagined for China relative to that of the United States and other members of this liberal rules-based international order in a more techno-authoritarian direction than what we would aspire to in the free market, democratic, capitalist West. So let's explore a little of how China has moved in this direction in recent years. So I'd like to start off with this map, ladies and gentlemen, that turns to the side, the axis of the planet, so that instead of the usual map where we see China to the left and the Pacific Ocean to the right, we have a sense of how China views its position vis-a-vis the rest of Asia and the Pacific Ocean, and especially the United States. And China feels that its rightful place, not only as a major economic power, but in Asia, is as the dominating hegemon. And this really was the case throughout most of modern China's history, the last centuries and last 2 millennia, where China was essentially the recipient of a tributary system of lesser societies and nations throughout the Asian continent, respecting the dominant colossal power of China. Today, China sees itself in a very different framework on the Asian continent, where the United States, which is a great power on the other side of the globe, has a pronounced presence throughout the Asian continent in ways that China feels artificially constrains and checks its rightful place in Asia and in the larger Pacific. So it looks out at the Pacific Ocean and sees 28 to 30,000 U.S. troops in South Korea. It sees about 48,000 U.S. troops in Japan, a very strong U.S.-Philippines defense cooperation agreement, strong U.S. ties with countries to the south, such as Indonesia, Thailand, and further south in Australia and New Zealand. And of course, U.S. bases in Guam, the U.S. state of Hawaii in the central of the Pacific Ocean. And China feels that the United States presence is an anti-Chinese coalition. But this is not the basis of the American presence, ladies and gentlemen. It goes back to the post-World War II era. And of course, we recall that Japan was the militaristic, nearly fascistic government in Asia in the early part of the 20th century and wreaked havoc in China and across Asia. And so post-World War II, the American strategy in creating the basis for this liberal, rules-based international order was to prevent another deleterious hegemon, one with malign intent, from ever establishing power in Asia. So in this case, it was originally to constrain Japan. And then, of course, in Europe, it was to constrain Germany. And here in Asia, what's happened is that several years after the end of World War II, you had the Communist Party take power in China in 1949. And so the strategy has grown not just to constrain the rise of a militaristic Japan, but to ensure that a communist China does not become the Asia hegemon. Well, China feels this is a repellent strategy by the United States that is constraining China's rightful place atop Asia. And this vision of China as the dominant hegemon is going to guide us through a number of strategies that China has undertaken since then. So we'll begin with the Belt Road Initiative, ladies and gentlemen. And this is perhaps one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the history of mankind. Anywhere from 800 billion to over $1 trillion has been invested so far by Chinese banks and Chinese state-owned enterprises and lending institutions to maybe 70 to 90 countries for hundreds of projects. There's no definitive Belt Road index here that we can use, but the rough estimate is those kinds of astounding investment figures in projects throughout South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and increasingly I was seeing even into potentially Latin America and the Caribbean. And what we have here is the Chinese export of credit matched by the Chinese export of excess industrial capacity and the Chinese export of excess labor capacity to build massive infrastructure projects involving roads and highways and high-speed trains and railways and tunnels and bridges and hydroelectric power generating systems and port facilities, improvements and construction, as well as airports. You name it. If it falls into the larger infrastructure project category, China has sought to build it around the world. And it's done so under what we would call predatory lending terms. Often these agreements are quite opaque. The repayment terms are very onerous. And in instances where countries or regions and provinces that have been unable to repay Chinese institutions under those onerous terms, we've seen either the surrender of sovereign assets. In Sri Lanka, a small island nation near India, an entire seaport had to be surrendered to the lending institution of China, literally sovereign territory of Sri Lanka. We've seen threats to do so in southern African countries. But where it doesn't make sense for China to seize those assets, what they've done instead is lean on those governments to vote either favorably or not inimically against China when there are resolutions that are raised at the United Nations or at international organizations regarding, for instance, China's human rights abuses or its violations of international law and agreements. And so we have a very dangerous development where we have many countries that are enormously dependent on China's goodwill, China's largesse, in ways that China has not seen fit to repay in any way. Let's move back across the Eurasian continent, ladies and gentlemen, to the South China Sea, which I will posit in many ways is one of the world's most important waterways. About 1.4 million square miles of international waters, through which about 1/4 to 1/3 of global commerce traverses alone through this waterway. And if you'll see here, if you follow the arrow, the Straits of Malacca here connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. And so what you have is the vast markets of China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and those of the Southeast Asian tiger economies, all dependent on commercial passage through the South China Sea for oil and natural gas from the Middle East, for natural resources from South Asia and from African countries, and to be able to export their finished products to prosperous markets in South Asia, in Africa, and especially to Europe, all passing through the South China Sea, which also possesses abundant fisheries to provide a high-protein diet for increasingly affluent societies in China and in other Southeast Asian countries. And also, geologists believe that as much as 12 to 15% of the world's untapped oil and natural gas reserves lie beneath the seabed of the South China Sea. Just to give you a sense of the primary importance of this waterway, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the Chinese government has declared this entire 1.4 million square miles of international waterways as essentially a sovereign Chinese lake. And you'll see here again, if you'll follow the arrow here, the cursor of this cow's tongue feature, almost 1,000 miles from China's coast, interestingly overlapping with the exclusive economic zone jurisdictions of a number of countries that also border the South China Sea. And the exclusive economic zone, ladies and gentlemen, is a jurisdiction under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that allows for sovereign jurisdiction from the surface of the oceans or the waterways, all of everything that is inside the water down to the seabed for up to 200 miles, unless there is an equidistant area that is less than 200 miles off of those coasts. And the way the Convention on the Law of the Sea is supposed to operate is that countries are supposed to mutually delineate their exclusive economic zones. There are no unilateral declarations, and certainly none that completely overlap those jurisdictions of neighboring countries. Well, going back to what I mentioned earlier, China, in rising to what it considers to be its rightful place as the center of a tributary network in Asia, has simply declared this is its sovereign area, and the countries will simply have to accommodate themselves to China because it is mightier and more powerful than they are. And one of the ways that it's looked to enforce this is by reclaiming and dredging a little more than half a dozen geographic features in the South China Sea, archipelagic areas such as atolls and reefs and shoals, and reclaimed them, dredged them, and now installed offensive weapons, radar systems, missile systems, and airports that are able to carry very heavy cargo loads, as well as attack helicopters in the area, and essentially defying any country in the area to push back against this type of Chinese military installation activity. And of course, none of them have that power to do so. The only power that does is the United States military. And so first under President Obama, then escalated significantly under President Trump, and continuing now under President Biden, the U.S. Navy, working with allied navies from Japan, from the United Kingdom, from France, from Australia, is conducting freedom of navigation operations through these areas to send a very clear message to Beijing that we do not respect their unilateral declaration of sovereign jurisdiction over the South China Sea, and especially those distinct island features. Now, there's a larger strategy here on the part of China as well, ladies and gentlemen. Going back to that map I showed you earlier, where we tilted the U.S. axis to the side of the Chinese government looking to militarily displace the United States as the premier military power in the Western Pacific region. And it's sought to do so by using, again, the astonishing economic growth of the last 30 years, facilitated by the United States and our global Western partners, and invested about 8 to 10% of that GDP growth into the military. So it's increased its military budget nearly 900% over the last 30 years to build what is a phenomenal military today, probably second only to the United States. One can argue where Russia fits in there because of its significant nuclear missile capability. But China is now building a phenomenal capability Navy and Air Force, in addition to its historic land-based army. And the strategy is to be able to deter the United States from undertaking any type of defensive operations on behalf of allies such as Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, or the Philippines, and increasingly, ironically, even countries such as Vietnam, which are very concerned about China's military activities in the region, so that the U.S. is unable to abide by the security agreements that it has with all of these countries. Then these countries, seeing that the U.S. is not able to provide that security blanket that they need against China, will eventually accommodate themselves to Chinese hegemony and respect China as the agent hegemon. And then it is the end of the liberal rules-based international order in the Western Pacific as we've known it. And China's longer-term strategy, ladies and gentlemen, is to push the U.S. back as far as Guam, which is the U.S. possession here in the Western Pacific, and then by 2049, which is the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party's takeover of the Chinese government, for China to be able to deploy a global world-class military that can compete with the United States on a global power projection scale. And they're very open about this, ladies and gentlemen. It's in all of their speeches. They're published in Mandarin. They're translated into English. So you're able to see what the Chinese government is openly projecting about its military capabilities in the next 15 to 30 years. And much of this military activity is likely going to be directed primarily, and perhaps sooner than we would want, against what it considers to be the rogue province of Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is populated by ethnic Chinese that fled the Chinese Communist Party at the end of the Civil War in 1949. And Taiwan poses no serious military threat to China in any meaningful way. But what it does pose is an incredibly dangerous, for the Chinese Communist Party, ideological alternative to the Chinese Communist Party's rule in mainland China. Because what you have is a successful, free market, democratic system in Taiwan that offers an alternative future for the Chinese people, for 1.4 billion people who right now live under communist rule. And so ideologically, it is very important for the Chinese Communist Party to eliminate this alternative vision for the future of China and to be able to deliver what it calls its one country, two systems promise to the Taiwanese people, which may have been a more credible promise before last year's takeover of the Hong Kong government and the gradual salami slice denial of democratic rights for the citizens of Hong Kong. And so as Taiwan sees what's happened in that city-state, they recognize they would become the next Hong Kong, lose their democratic freedoms, lose their ability to engage and interact globally as a free market system, and are now developing what we call a porcupine defense strategy that would make any type of a Chinese military invasion or series of operations against Taiwan so incredibly painful, not only to the Chinese military, but then as an addendum to the Chinese economy and potentially to Chinese society, by giving deep strike missile capability to Taiwan to be able to strike targets deep inside of China, so as to deter China from ever seriously considering an invasion strategy against Taiwan. And I think you'll see the Biden administration continuing to move in this direction, where we maintain what we call a strategic ambiguity policy. We don't ever state whether or not we would definitely come to Taiwan's defense, because the strategy is to keep China guessing. And the more China is uncertain, the less likely it is, we believe, to ever invade Taiwan. But to arm Taiwan to the teeth with defensive weapons, to make even the concept of an invasion so painful that no Chinese leader would risk it. And we saw what happened about 10 days ago. Many of you may have seen in the news that the Chinese government stepped up its air activity inside of Taiwan's air defense identification zone, about 149 sorties into this Taiwanese zone. It's not a violation of Taiwan's sovereignty, but there are transgressions against Taiwan's air defense systems. And we're going to see, I fear, escalated Chinese air activity and naval activity to try to intimidate and to attrit and to exhaust Taiwan's ability to defend itself, so it eventually has to negotiate its absorption into mainland China. So this is going to be a key focus of U.S. and Western activity and concern in the Western Pacific region. And I'll add the geoeconomic aspect to this, ladies and gentlemen. And that is not just that Taiwan is the world's 20th or 22nd largest economy, but as many of you probably know very well, the Taiwan economy is the producer of about 80 to 90% of the world's most advanced and most complex microprocessors. And any type of a military operation in Taiwan that would be prolonged could plunge the global economy into recession, if not outright depression, depending on how devastating the Chinese attacks would have to be if they ever decided to move against Taiwan militarily. Now, much of this technological concern on the part of the West is played out in China's strategy to become the global leader in the technological realm, as well as in the economic realm and the military realm. And we see here a very easy graphic to understand of the phenomenal rise in China's R&D investment over the years. Again, much of this taking place since its astonishing growth economically since coming into the World Trade Organization 20 years ago. And much of this is going to be based on two forward-leaning directions for Beijing. The first one is the Made in China 2025 strategy, which was launched in 2015 and won't likely be realized within the next 4 years, but it's looking to aspire to accomplish many of these goals in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And that is for China to become the world leader in many of the world's most advanced breakthrough technologies: quantum computing, aerospace, biopharmaceuticals, robotics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, you name it. If it is going to be a leading technology of the 21st century, China aims to be the global leader in those fields, and it is investing hundreds of billions of dollars in state-directed assets towards attaining that goal. And this is being complemented by a more recent strategy known as China Standards 2035. And that is as the internet and all of the attendant technologies are going to increasingly dominate the global economy in the years and decades to come of this century, that China would look to displace the United States, Japan, Germany, and the technological powers of the last 100 years, so that China becomes the standard setter for international norms and platforms of all of the future major technologies. And in this way, China would look to displace the United States as the global leader in the technological realm. And one of the key partners for the United States in looking to compete with China here is the government of Japan, now led by the newly elected Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida. And Japan, in many ways, ladies and gentlemen, is maybe one of the most undervalued allies of the United States. And I would posit that it is a critical partner in so many ways that are simply not well understood. Now, we know, of course, that Japan is one of the world's leading economic powers. It's currently the third largest economy in the world. It could be displaced by India in the next 10 to 15 years. So if it's not the third largest, it'll be the fourth largest. But we're very much concerned, again, about Japan's security, as I demonstrated in one of the earlier graphics, with the outsized U.S. military presence in Japan, about 48,000 troops. But we're also looking to constrain what we consider to be North Korea's very malign activities in the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. And in recent weeks, we've seen North Korea ramping up again its ballistic missile testing. And these go across South Korea into the Sea of Japan, towards Japan. And even as we're very much concerned about North Korea potentially remaining a nuclear power, there's also the concern, ladies and gentlemen, of these activities triggering a minor conventional conflict that could drag in South Korea, Japan, China, under the fog of war, China also moves against Taiwan, possibly pulling in Russia to the north of Japan. And of course, the United States coming to the defense of Japan, South Korea, and potentially Taiwan. So we're very concerned about protecting that security and defense umbrella for Japan in this very dangerous part of the world. And this Venn diagram gives us a sense of how Japan is a critical partner, not only as an economic power in the G7, but as a leading democratic partner that offers an alternative to China's increasingly techno-authoritarian system, as a leading technology power, as I just mentioned, because the US doesn't do industrial policy the way China does or the way other Western countries, say in Europe or Japan might, to be a technology leader with the United States in R&D and to help maintain the global West advantage over China. And then in a new quadrilateral security dialogue known as the Quad for short, consisting of the US and Japan, and also including India and Australia. And I offer this larger visual map, ladies and gentlemen, of the Indo-Pacific region, because the US once looked at the Pacific theater as a singular military command, but really with the rise of India as a great power in Asia and the growing importance of maritime security because of the maritime supply chains that link Europe and the Middle East across South Asia to Asian markets, we now look at this as a more comprehensive Indo-Pacific framework for security, for commerce, and for diplomacy. And so here in the Northeast area, we have Japan. In the Southeast, we have Australia. And here in the Northwest, we have India working together to provide for free and open shipping throughout the Indo-Pacific region in ways that bring tremendous benefits, not only to the United States and to our partners, but even to adversary countries such as China, in the effort to persuade them in the long term that the preservation and sustenance of this system is in the entire global economy's interest and not just those of the global West. And India will become an increasingly important country to keep your eyes on, ladies and gentlemen. It will soon surpass China's population, maybe reaching 1.5 to 1.6 billion people. It is the world's largest democracy. It operates largely on the remnants of a British colonial past, so that it has a far more developed legal system than many other underdeveloped or less developed economies. But it is grappling with a very sclerotized bureaucracy. There are still profound social problems inside of India regarding its caste system, and also the fact that it has the second largest Muslim population in the world after Indonesia. But that minority is often chafing against what is an increasingly nationalistic Hindu leadership, especially epitomized right now by the ruling party governed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But India, I believe, is going to be strategically a very important partner of the United States. It won't be a junior country the way many European countries are, because India itself is the inheritor of a great Asian civilization, as is China. But watch this Quad relationship to emerge into a very critical component of our overall long-term Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, this was complemented, as you may have heard several weeks ago, by a stunning new security agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, where Australia has now canceled a $66 billion submarine contract with France and joined with the US and the UK to form what we call AUKUS, AUKUS. And this is going to be another complementary mini coalition in the Pacific, specifically devised to check China's military ambitions in the Pacific Ocean. But this led to a severe rupture in relations between Washington and Paris. And for the first time in our 200 plus years of diplomatic relations, the French government recalled its ambassador from Washington to denote the fury of French President Emmanuel Macron at President Biden for what the French considered to be a stab in the back in negotiating and secretly coming to this agreement with the United Kingdom and with Australia. Obviously, it caused significant damage to the French economy because of the cancellation of this multi-billion-dollar submarine contract. But more important, it was a diplomatic slap in the face to France, which itself is an Indo-Pacific power. And you see here from this map, these light blue areas, ladies and gentlemen, here represent the exclusive economic zones of France, because it possesses many islands, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and a number of other small islands, not only here in the Southern Pacific, this one here, where France had to resolve a sovereignty dispute with Mexico here for Clipperton Island, and also here in the Indian Ocean. But France is a Pacific power. There are 1.6 million French citizens in the Pacific region, and it actually has deployed 8,000 troops to protect its interests there. And so the US and France now have to work to repair their relationship, to rebuild the trust. And this, of course, will play out in France's own long-term interest in becoming a more influential power on the European continent, now that Chancellor Angela Merkel is retiring from German politics and will likely be succeeded by the Social Democratic Union leader, Olaf Scholz. Now, Mr. Scholz, who won the election several weeks ago by a slim margin over former Chancellor Merkel's, well, she's still Chancellor now until the new government is actually negotiated. Her party was defeated by a very slim margin, and so Mr. Scholz now is in negotiations, very intense negotiations, with the pro-free market business party in Germany, as well as the eco-radical Green party. And this is a party that is singularly committed to promoting what they call consider sound climate policies. It may also take a much more hawkish position against China on human rights abuses, whereas the pro-business party that Mr. Scholz is negotiating with is going to be defending Germany's industrial interests in promoting as much of an export base to China as possible, and to put geopolitical considerations to the side. And the degree to which Mr. Scholz is able to fill the leadership vacuum that is left by Angela Merkel's departure will shape whether or not Germany will retain its de facto status as the leading, not just economic, but diplomatic power in Europe, or whether that's going to be a vacuum that's going to be filled by the French president, because France now has the largest military in the European Union in post-Brexit. In a post-Brexit EU, now that the United Kingdom's military is out of the equation. But Mr. Macron faces his own electoral test with French presidential elections coming up in April. Our larger concern in Germany, ladies and gentlemen, on the geopolitical and geoeconomic front is Germany's accelerated dependence at a time of current. If you're looking at the news right now, the current energy crisis, not only affecting Germany, but a number of other European countries, as well as countries such as China, which is blacking out entire cities and regions because of their energy crunch, and those of other developed countries. But the German government concluded its Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal with Russia that would literally double the amount of natural gas that Russia supplies to Germany at a time when the United States is still stationing at least 25,000 troops on German bases to nominally protect Germany from a Russian threat, while Germany becomes more dependent on Russia for its energy. And this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, ladies and gentlemen, is causing significant problems with other European Union countries such as Poland, which may lose $500 billion over the next $500 million annually over the next several years, as well as a country such as Ukraine, which Russia still occupies and where there's actually still a war going on. There are combat operations in eastern Ukraine that the media simply isn't covering for American audiences any longer. And so we'll look to see whether this is part of a larger strategy of not only German, but potentially larger EU independence from the United States in ways that can also be deleterious to the transatlantic alliance through the NATO system that we've enjoyed for the last 70 years. Now, this is all part and parcel of a longer-term strategy by Vladimir Putin, not only with the United States today, but going back to probably the end of the Bush administration and certainly through the Obama and Trump administrations, where Russia, which given its size and its natural wealth, really should be a far wealthier country, but its economy is about the size of Italy's. But Vladimir Putin is looking to be a disruptor of a first-class level against the United States and against Europe to every degree possible, diplomatically, politically, economically, and militarily, and specifically with efforts to try to undermine our faith in our democratic systems, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in specific European countries. And the problem that we face with Russia, ladies and gentlemen, is that it is a vast power every day of the year. Russia is not a country that we can selectively decide to engage or to not engage. It is a vast country, and this is a map of Russia that is completely inverted to give you a different sense of how China views its geopolitical position on the Eurasian continent. It is a vast country that spans 11 time zones. It possesses about 1/8 of the world's landmass, and it is able to project power in Europe, in the Black Sea region, in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Central Asia, and all the way to its east. It looks like it's west here on this upside down map, in the Far East with Japan, the Korean Peninsula, and China, as well as Alaska across the Bering Strait. And so Russia is a country that we have to engage very smartly, very prudently, and with great discernment every day of the year. And President Biden is coming to realize this despite much of his anti-Russian rhetoric in last year's presidential campaign, because to date, Vladimir Putin has denied the United States the ability to move forces into Central Asian countries where Russia still has significant influence. These were countries that were formerly in the Soviet Union. And for President Biden to be able to conduct what we call over-the-horizon operations to strike at terrorist organizations or terrorist base camps in the Taliban-governed Afghanistan is going to be rendered much, much more difficult to achieve if we don't have access to Afghanistan from Central Asia, which to date we do not. And so now we face a quandary in the aftermath of the rapid U.S. Diplomatic and military withdrawal from Afghanistan of being able to credibly strike at some of these regrouping organizations, not only the Taliban, which is, for lack of a better phrase, an actual terrorist organization that is governing a relatively modern nation state. I'll just say at least a nation state in 2021. One can argue how modern Afghanistan actually is. Right now, we have to depend on bases in distant United Arab Emirates and in Qatar and the Persian Gulf to be able to strike, if we need to, at any terrorist assets in Afghanistan. We are concerned in the short term, depending on how cold the winter is and to what degree there may actually be food insecurity from a projected famine. And what seems to be the case, the Afghan government is nearing bankruptcy. It's nearing insolvency. And there is no significant international aid coming in because almost no other country in the world chooses to recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. To what degree we may see a significant outflow of migrants and refugees from Afghanistan towards Europe, maybe not to the degree that we saw out of Syria in 2015, which completely shocked domestic European political systems. But we could have this type of disruption across Iran, Turkey, and Greece en route to Europe. But I think what we're also very much concerned about is the degree to which there are rare earth metals in Afghanistan that could be very valuable to a country such as China, which is cultivating good relations with the Taliban and wants to use those rare earths to dominate the technologies of the 21st century, as we noted earlier. China will look to the Afghan government to make sure that there are no Uyghur terrorist operations against West China interests in Xinjiang province. But also we're looking to see to what extent there is going to be the possible export and sale of up to $24 billion in U.S. advanced weaponry that was abandoned in Afghanistan in the hasty withdrawal that might be made available to organizations such as Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, which still operates in northern Iraq, increasingly in places such as southern Libya and other countries in the sub-Saharan and Sahel countries of northern Africa, and the Haqqani Network, which is maybe the most brutal of the well-known radical Islamist terror organizations, which in turn will require now the resumption of U.S. and allied regional and global counterterrorism responses, given what we expect to be a resurgent global jihadist movement in the months ahead or the next several years. Now, much of this comes back to the problems that we continue to face with the world's leading state sponsor of international terrorism, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran, led by the revolutionary Shia theocratic supreme leader Ali Khamenei. We're in a very interesting negotiating tangle right now with Iran, ladies and gentlemen, because you will recall that President Obama entered into the nuclear weapons development agreement with Tehran in 2015, along with a number of European countries, China and Russia. President Trump pulled the United States out of that agreement, which was never submitted to the Senate for ratification. So it remained essentially like an executive order that a president can reinstate or withdraw from. And President Biden wants the United States to re-enter the agreement. But the question is, what will the Iranian government seek to extract as a concession from the United States in order to restart serious negotiations and eventually come back in? And right now, it looks like the Iranian government is looking for the United States to lift all serious sanctions on the Iranian economy, on the Iranian export of oil and natural gas, in ways to free up the flow of funds back into an Iranian economy that has been devastated by these U.S. sanctions over the years. Our concern, of course, is that Iran, which continues to develop a very dangerous ballistic missile capability that is able to strike with relative accuracy across a significant range of countries in this diametric circle here, will be able to develop a nuclear weapons capability that it can then install atop these ballistic missiles. And if Iran develops nuclear weapons and is able to place them safely and accurately on top of ballistic missiles, it is essentially a strategic game changer from Europe into the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and deep into South Asia, an extraordinarily disruptive development in global affairs that the U.S. and our allies profess to want to prevent. The concern that many have is that the nuclear agreement that President Obama and other parties entered into in 2015 does not prevent Iran from attaining a nuclear weapons capability. It simply delays it. And the question really for the West and for the international community, to the degree that a community like that exists, is, do we have the capability and the will to actually prevent Iran from attaining nuclear weapons? Or is this simply a matter of politicians conveniently kicking this very dangerous nuclear can down the road? But you have an understanding, ladies and gentlemen, of the centrality of this issue of Iran as to why the Middle East continues to be such an important region for the global economy, even if it isn't for the United States as much anymore, because we're largely energy independent now, thanks to the hydraulic fracturing revolution of the last 15 years. But our allies in Asia and Europe are still inordinately dependent on the Middle East for oil and natural gas. And so this map here gives you a sense of not only the major ports through which oil and natural gas are shipped around the world, but also the critical choke points that are very, very dangerous for the international supply chain system, much of which we've had revealed to us, those of us who do not work day to day in supply chain management as a result of the COVID pandemic. And what we have is a very uncertain situation that's exemplified by the backlog right now at the Los Angeles and Long Beach ports, ladies and gentlemen, where pre-COVID, on a bad day, there might be 2 or 3 ships, container ships, anchored out at sea waiting to offload. And in recent weeks, we've had anywhere from 60 to 70 ships that are anchored out at sea. And if the data is correct that I picked up last night, this past Sunday, 2 days ago, there were 87 ships, an unprecedented number of ships that were anchored out in Long Beach port, waiting to come in to be offloaded. And it's a much more complex discussion than unfortunately we have time for here. But if one looks at the surge in demand as the economies have rebounded from the initial lockdowns of last year, the incredible disruption to worker provisions here, truckers, warehouse workers, and the like, different systems of hours. In Asia, they are loading container ships literally 24/7 across the world's largest ports, whereas here in the United States, we have lesser hours on Saturdays and Sundays. We don't have a fully integrated system from midnight until 6 a.m. And so we have a tremendous backlog of container ships to be offloaded here at our ports. And it's going to be increasingly disruptive to the U.S. economy in the months ahead. And there are many experts who know the supply chain logistics system far better than I do that predict we may not be able to reach normality until early 2023. And much of this is rooted in the tremendous pace of industrialization, not only in the West, but especially in Asia over the last half century, ladies and gentlemen. And the downside of that tremendous industrialization that's lifted hundreds of millions of people from abject poverty into some level of middle-class lifestyle affluence is the carbon emissions that has resulted, that has led to many of the concerns that we have about the global environment and the need for more prudent climate policies moving forward. And you see here how much of this carbon emission acceleration really is rooted in India, China, and Asia since maybe the 1970s. And much of it is still concentrated there, both in China, which even though it declared last week it will no longer finance coal plants around the world, continues to build effectively a new coal plant in China every week, and will continue to do so until 2030, when it's agreed to reach peak emissions under the Paris Accord. So much of the climate policy on a global scale really needs to concentrate on what not only China is going to be doing, but how we deal with the underdeveloped economies in Africa and in South Asia that are still burning wood and dung and will need massive electrification projects to be able to jumpstart their economies into a more modern direction. And also the fact that India still has maybe 100 to 200 million citizens that have no regular access to electricity. So we have to balance out the need to provide for better climate management, and maybe that will include disaster management so that technology helps us adapt to climate change, but also providing for the kind of economic growth that many of our poorer neighbors around the world are very much entitled to. And I'll close, ladies and gentlemen, with this graphic here of how climate and global economic growth all come together in the context of the supply chain and dependence on shipping for the global economic prosperity we enjoy today. This is a map that is produced in China, which is not an Arctic power. There's not a single inch of Chinese territory inside the Arctic Circle, but there is a strategic interest on the part of China in taking advantage of the warming waters along the Russian frontier, which are now passable anywhere from 6 to 10 months out of the year, to provide for new maritime superhighways to replace the one that I showed you earlier across the Indian Ocean, and shave off about 25 to 30% of the time that it takes to connect container ports in Northeast Asia, especially from China, through this Russian frontier in the Arctic to ports in Northern Europe. And so Russia has now built up or fortified about 12.5 air and naval facilities to be able to dominate this new maritime superhighway. And China in the future is looking not only to send more and more small and medium-sized container ships, because the waters are too shallow for the supermax container ships that traverse the oceans. So they'll be moving across the frontier and already have in the last 2 to 3 years. But eventually, if the warming of the Arctic Ocean continues north of Canada, to be able to provide for quicker access to major port facilities on the eastern seaboard of North America. So, Gina, I think with that, maybe we'll close the presentation. I forgot to include this last slide here, ladies and gentlemen, if I might. And that is one of the great promises for the energy revolution of the years and decades to come is going to be the massive investment that we see already in clean, renewable hydrogen. And the projections right now are anywhere from $500 to $650 billion in major hydrogen projects from public-private partnerships by 2030 in the next 9 to 10 years to help move us in a cleaner, decarbonized direction. And that may also be aided and abetted by a renewed focus on small modular nuclear power that is also carbon-free and far safer than the nuclear technology that really put a scare into many Western systems back with Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island of several decades ago. So there's great, great promise in at least some of the breakthrough technologies that are available to us today that need to be scaled properly to be able to be commercialized on a global basis over the next 10 to 20 years. And so with that, Gina, I will close the presentation, and I hope this offers us some time for Q&A from your audience.
Thank you, John. Do you really want Gina, or is it all right if I ask you the Q&A? Oh, am I connected? Well, hopefully this is coming through loud and clear. So thank you, John. First, a little quick comment that I used to think high yield is a little scary, but maybe it's time for me to recalibrate things. But now on to some questions. We have a question from somebody who's thinking about buying a Tesla. Thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. Could you comment on the global race for control of rare earth metals?
Yes, this is going to be an increasingly prominent subject as we study the direction of the global economy in the years to come. Now, rare earths are the types of minerals that are very important for the production of critical technological products, whether it's smartphones, computers, laptops, electric batteries for automated vehicles and the like. And they tend to be found around the world. So the ability to find rare earths is not a problem. Rare earths, really, the term rare is in the ability to process them and to use them in a meaningful manner, because the extraction process itself is a very dirty process. It has caused great damage to the environment where it's been undertaken in the past. And we had rare earth processing mines here in the United States, but largely because of environmental regulations, we've made that such a costly process. It was effectively outsourced to countries such as China, which have, of course, far less regard for the environmental degradation that rare earths processing causes. What we have is a situation today where China dominates the rare earths processing of probably 90 to 95% of global rare earths needs. So we have the minerals available. The question is, can we develop a process in the United States and in allied countries, not only to locate rare earths, as we believe may exist, for instance, as I mentioned, in Afghanistan. The US Geological Survey in 2010 determined that there may be as much as $1 trillion, that's TR, $1 trillion worth of rare earth minerals, especially gold, copper, iron ore, but even like lithium, which you need for electric vehicle batteries, found under Afghanistan's surface. But how do you access it? How do you extract it? And how do you do so in an environmentally responsible manner? I can tell you that any other government right now has determined the most effective strategy for doing so. And that's going to be one of the great challenges for the US government, but I think really for our private sector, which has been where we go to for the technologically innovative solutions to these types of problems. But there's no doubt about it. The Chinese government has a significant head start on rare earths processing, and we're going to have to climb our way back out of this situation. And it's a process that may take many years.
Thank you. What is the future of NATO?
The future of NATO, well, it's always a dangerous business doing any type of forecasting. So I don't want to pretend that I know what the exact future is, but I think there's going to be significant soul searching inside of the NATO alliance for quite some time to come. And even before this rupture in US-French relations, Macron had been giving speeches for a number of years, calling the NATO alliance, I believe the exact term he used was brain dead. And it's really no fault of any particular party here, Andrew. I just want to be clear. I think a lot of this is a sense of mission creep or maybe mission confusion, because the NATO alliance was formed in order to prevent the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And now some of us are dating ourselves. I'm sure many of your audience members have no recollection of the Cold War or the Soviet Union's threats to invade Western Europe. But it was designed for a purpose that maybe is no longer essential 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union. So what NATO has really been doing for the most part is promoting a larger sense of the expansion of the democratic world of free market systems and looking to uphold what I mentioned several times as the liberal rules-based order where it's feasible to do so. But you don't have equal levels of commitment to the NATO alliance inside of Europe, for instance, Andrew. So you have countries such as Poland and the Baltic countries that are very threatened by Russia today, and they very much want that American security blanket as close to their countries and their militaries as possible. Then you have countries such as France, which want to have a more independent European Union. And because the UK is out of the EU now, the French military is unchallenged as the most powerful one inside of Europe. And so Macron now is calling for strategic autonomy, as if to say that the EU can create its own military force. But most of Europe has taken a more pacifist bent, essentially, for lack of a more diplomatic phrase, spoiled by the size and willingness of the United States military to provide for Europe's protection. And so more European spending goes for social programs and for entitlement, sort of cradle to grave, than is the case in the US. So very long answer to a very concise question. I believe that most leaders in the NATO countries, the US and the leading powers in Europe, see the importance of the NATO alliance as a structure for a cohesive Western military response in the event of a crisis. But what that crisis looks like and where it materializes is going to be a continuing debate for Europe. I don't believe the European Union is capable of a military alternative to NATO, but I don't know that the NATO alliance is going to remain cohesive, especially if there are political divides inside of the transatlantic alliance about how to respond to Russian energy dominance of Europe and the need for countries like Germany to continue to depend on the Chinese market for export dominance.
Thank you. How about Brexit? Is that a possibility, and what are your thoughts there?
Brexit as in France?
Yes.
It's not a concept that I'm very familiar with. I think right now, after Brexit, the major concern is with the possibility that Poland might exit. And this really comes down to a major political and legal series of disputes between Brussels, between the European Union institutions and countries such as Poland and Hungary, that many in Brussels feel are moving in a more illiberal direction and are not adhering to EU institutions and norms and frameworks, as is their obligation. I don't know that France really has a long-term strategic interest in ever leaving the European Union, as I've mentioned, I believe now on several occasions. First of all, from a military perspective, there is no more effective tool for France to be a dominant power inside the European Union than through its military power projection on the continent, in Africa, in the Middle East, in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, as I demonstrated with the graphic earlier. Its economy is not as powerful as Germany's. And as a matter of fact, some might argue that when there was talk of Brexit, when there were German officials that were seriously thinking about even temporarily ejecting Greece from the European Union, or at least from the Eurozone 6 years ago, that part of that thinking was to send a message to more profligate economies along the southern belt of the European Union. And by this, I mean Italy, Spain, Portugal, but even to a certain degree, France, to really tighten their economies, to engage in more fiscally disciplined approaches. And so I don't know that really there's much of an economic argument that France has for any type of an exit anytime soon. So in a nutshell, I don't see Brexit as any strategic reality, any type of an option that would be plausible anytime in the foreseeable future. There's too much at stake for France to be the most powerful member of the European Union in almost every way except economically.
Thank you. You describe many global threats to Western security. How well are Western governments and societies positioned to navigate these threats?
That's an area that concerns me. You know, and we have to be careful to not pretend that there's this one larger Western global blob where we all think alike and act alike and respond alike. And even in the US, right, we understand realistically that we live today in a very polarized American society. Our political parties are frayed in many ways and are being pulled to the extremes, both in the Democratic and in the Republican parties. And we also have now the experience of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And there's a sense in the US alone that we're a quote unquote war-weary nation. I'm not convinced of that, Andrew. I actually think the problem in the United States is that we haven't formulated winning strategies when we deploy our military forces. And I think if there were a military crisis where we saw either a direct or a serious threat to the homeland or to the United States or our global interests, we would respond supportively if we saw a realistic strategy and one that has a winnable strategy. But if it's not a winnable strategy, we won't support it again. The problem I see in Europe is that, as I just mentioned, many European societies have taken on a decidedly pacifist approach. Even in Germany, which is a country that historically has been threatened by Russia and now spends less than 1%, maybe now it's about 1.3, 1.4% of its annual GDP on military and defense purposes. But when the German soldiers have to use broomsticks instead of rifles for military exercises, we know we're not talking about a serious defense capability. So there are certain European countries that are far readier to deploy militarily, especially the United Kingdom and France, but other countries perhaps less so. In Asia, it's a very different story because I think many of our Asian allies feel directly threatened by China. And that's because China has engaged in very belligerent and hostile activities along the 2,000-mile border with India, against Taiwan. It directly threatens the sovereignty of Japanese islands. It is engaged in the harassment of the naval forces and merchant marines of the Philippines and Vietnam. And so it is very openly and directly hostile. And so I think in the event of a crisis in Asia, we would find ready allied partners there to respond. The problem is the cost would be so enormous that would, I think, be what maybe has everyone thinking hard about how quickly and how decisively to respond. So I think there are different responses with different allies responding to different crises in different parts of the world, if that's a fair answer to your question.
Thank you. Will U.S. companies continue to move production out of China into other Asian nations, back to the U.S., whatever the case may be? What are your thoughts there?
I think that is an objective of the U.S. government, and we certainly saw that beginning with the Trump administration when it was revealed to us how utterly dependent the U.S. economy is on China, not only for health equipment and medical supplies and pharmaceuticals, but also for critical other aspects of the American economy. But the problem that we face here is, A, we don't have, as I mentioned earlier, an industrial policy approach to U.S. governance. We very much adhere to the degree possible with a well-regulated free market system. And so I don't see any type of a serious industrial strategy coming out of Washington, especially given the nature of our political relations in Washington right now. Again, very polarized process. So I don't see the parties coming together. But also, I think really much of this comes down to what executives in private companies decide is best for their bottom line. And however much we may argue that geopolitically and geoeconomically, it makes the greatest sense possible to reshore as many critical industries either back into the United States for our own domestic manufacturing or to more reliable partners and allies, for instance, Canada and Mexico under the USMCA trade agreement that was executed by the Trump administration, that many private company executives still see that factory floors in China, and for that matter, other countries that neighbor China and could be threatened by China, such as Vietnam, such as India, such as Indonesia, such as the Philippines, still offer very reliable, very convenient, very cost-effective factory floors that are simply difficult to replace, as well as those inside of China. I do think that what you may see is more regulation coming out of Washington on militarily sensitive technologies and, of course, the health sector. That these are existential issues for the United States, and so there will be incentives and disincentives for companies that are currently involved in military technology or health and medical supply manufacturing inside of China to move those out. But when it comes to non-security related consumer goods, clothing, electronics, and the like, I don't think you'll have any consensus on the part of the U.S. government in that direction.
Thank you so much, John. This was terrific. There are still a lot of questions, but luckily John will be at our reception this evening. So for everyone that would like to continue the dialogue, he's graciously going to come by and visit. I'm looking forward to meeting you actually live, face-to-face, John. And this was a terrific session. Thank you so very much. Zach, I think it's back to you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks, everybody. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back at 11:15 with an economic outlook. So thank you, both of you, and everyone, enjoy your break.